The congregate institutional model has survived because it's there, it's been there, it's entrenched, it has a constituency, and historically, just even when scandals and abuses and mismanagement reveal themselves, the effort has always been to fix it rather than replace it. You never underestimate the resilience of institutional systems. But they survive because people want them to survive, because they meet somebody's need. It may not be the population that they serve, but as long as they meet somebody's needs and they have a constituency, they tend to go on. And so that is why they survive today. And I've spent 30 years pondering this question.
The San Francisco Industrial School opened its doors in the late 1850s. During this time, the city was undergoing an increase in population with the arrival of immigrants in search of gold. What was once a small town quickly transformed into a great metropolis where families and young men from all over came in order to seek their fortune.
In the case of the industrial school, I mean, you kind of have a classic situation because you have a city that has exploded, its population has exploded, and it's, and, in 1847, the population of San Francisco was about 400, and by 1855, it's roughly 60,000. So it's a phenomenal growth, and it comes with it the expected social problems, and we had them. And this was a wild place, and people came out here seeking their fortune in the gold rush, and only to be disappointed. And so you had high levels of alcoholism, you had high levels of child abandonment, and so kids were left to wander the streets of San Francisco. So the industrial school was seen as the solution to that, and the early city founders looked towards the East Coast, looked towards the eastern cities and those houses of refuge as solutions to the growing number of kids wandering the streets of San Francisco. And so that was the birth of the industrial school.
Houses of refuge incarcerated youth for the purpose of refuge and reform. In this system, youth were subject to a regimented schedule where they learned work habits that stressed the importance of religious and moral virtues. Youth lived in fortress-like structures with multiple levels and big open dormitories. Like other reform institutions of the time, the San Francisco Industrial School followed this congregate care model of housing youth as a primary way of dealing with youth who were deemed unfit by society. Consequently, most of the youth who were committed to the institution were held for living a life of idleness and vagrancy instead of committing an actual crime.
In the early 19th century, the first youth institutions outside of orphanages were called houses of refuge. The first house of refuge was established in 1825 in New York. And its primary focus was taking abused, neglected, mildly delinquent, vagrant kids off the street. And it represented a vast expansion in the role and responsibility of government or government entities or its designated agents in the care and treatment of children. We look at a seminal event in the development of youth institutions in the 19th century in the United States. It's the creation of the New York House of Refuge. And so that model became the model for all subsequent institutions. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
for the rest of the century, and to some degree, right up till now, because our our youth correctional institutions in most states currently still follow that congregate institutional design, as do our adult prisons.
Given the stark similarities between industrial schools and the adult prison system, industrial schools quickly made attempts to resemble public schools rather than jails. Thus, industrial institutions presented themselves to the public as schools with the focus of educating and reforming youth. Like our current juvenile justice system, industrial schools during the 19th century invoked the legal doctrine of parens patriae, a doctrine that limited constitutional due process rights to children. This doctrine gave the state the right to determine what was in the best interest of the child, often overruling the rights of parents.
The legal justification for removing children from the streets and placing them in institutions, which really amounted to a deprivation of liberty, because the kids, once they were placed in a house of refuge or a reform school, you weren't free to go, whether you committed a crime or not. And remember, most of them did not commit a crime, but it was under the guise of the state was protecting them. And it wasn't about, the state wasn't imprisoning them, they were protecting them, and therefore it was justified under the legal interpretations of the day.
And so, another job for the police and the courts. Johnny Marvin is now in the hands of the law. This is the first time he's been caught, but his delinquent tendencies began long before in the conflicts of an unhappy home and in the hangout of the gang which was his refuge. Now, what will become of this boy? What road lies ahead for this sullen, misguided 15-year-old? Will he be placed in a cell for the night, herded with drunks and criminals, then in the morning paraded in the police lineup? Will he be fingerprinted, photographed, given a permanent criminal record at 15? Will he be sentenced by a judge who knows nothing of the background of Johnny and his family or the reasons behind his behavior? Will he grow up in reformatories and prisons to become a bitter and seasoned criminal? Johnny and 200,000 other youngsters who are arrested each year are America's #1 crime problem. Can't something be done to help these twisted young lives and set them straight?
And it was really the basis for child advocates of the day to call for greater societal responsibility for these children when otherwise they would be left on their own. It was certainly, well founded. The problem with it is it also created a lot of injustice. The reality within the institutions, as we know, was often much different than what was pronounced to the public. And typically, the typical institution of the mid 19th century was underfunded. You had even though many of them were said that they were to emphasize education, very often they had very limited capacity, inadequate, not enough teachers, not enough trained teachers, not enough resources within the institutions, and it was very clear that in many cases the children who resided within these institutions were a societal afterthought.
Throughout the course of its history, the industrial school underwent a series of scandals that still exist in youth correctional institutions today. Instances of staff brutality and victimization were commonplace, as was the abuse of girls and younger inmates. Acts of brutality and financial embezzlement soon led to public investigations and social protest. By the end of the 19th century, it was clear the industrial school was failing in its mission of reforming and educating youth. While there were several court cases that challenged the constitutionality of the industrial school, most were defeated on the legal basis of parens patriae. This law justified youth institutions as places of reform rather than places of punishment. In 1892, the industrial school was ordered to close.
The reality is the situation in the industrial school never changed. During its 30-year history, it was a turbulent period. When it finally closed down in 1890, the headline in the San Francisco newspaper was, "Closed down at last. Industrial school passes into history, long denounced by the city's judiciary as a school of crime." And so when it finally did pass into history, the consensus was good. I mean, city officials took the attitude that good riddance, that it needed to go, and that the consensus was that the industrial school had been an utter and complete failure. Ironically, what the state did is they turned around and established 2 state-run reform schools along a similar model. So we've been repeating the same mistake ever since.
Although reform schools have received a substantial amount of criticism by child advocates, social justice educators, and policymakers, they have remained the fundamental model for detaining youth for almost 2 centuries now. While the San Francisco Industrial School laid the components for California's juvenile justice system, it was never successful in accomplishing its primary goal of reforming youth.
I often get asked the question, why do we still have congregate training schools or congregate reform schools? Why do we still continue to follow a model that was established in the 19th century and frankly was discredited to the most part in the 19th century if you read much of the, some of the critiques of the institutions back then? I think the answer lies in human behavior and maybe the study of organizational behavior. Once these institutions were created, they took on a life of their own. It's like anything else, whether it's a school, whether it's an auto factory, whatever. People's livelihoods become dependent on it. You establish the foundation, and that foundation stays. It plants itself, and over time, it's self-perpetuating. Because what happens is people come in, it becomes an important source of livelihood. With just that alone, is a primary factor in explaining why these things go on and on. Their jobs. But along with that, you also have they also take on a life of their own, because over time, certain routines set in, become commonplace. Practices become commonplace. Training materials, policies, they're all built around sustaining that institutional structure. And what it ends up doing is it ensures that institutional structure continues on into the next generation after generation.
The idea that youth institutions operate like schools and not jails has justified the existence of youth correctional facilities since their inception as houses of refuge during the early 1800s. While California's state correctional system continues to follow this historical pattern, child advocates have placed it under scrutiny for violating basic human rights. Like the San Francisco Industrial School, today's correctional system has failed in meeting its mission of providing youth with educational and treatment services.